It's a great pleasure to have Preston Scott Cohen here tonight. As you probably know, the whole recent history of architecture has been very much involved with the whole discussion and relationship between form and function. And for so long, in a sense, there has been some kind of prioritization of function over form. The work of Preston Scott Cohen, in a sense, begins to question this prioritization and addresses the question of autonomy of architectural form by beginning to, or attempting to, problematize architectural form itself. We are, in a sense, very pleased to have the exhibition upstairs that demonstrates some of the recent work of Preston Scott Cohen dealing with the whole analysis of form. One of the things that I think is very important about the work is the way in which the question of architectural drawing, specifically descriptive geometry, is being used in order to set up alternative architectural schemas, ones that come precisely from this involvement, engagement, and, as I said, the problematization of form itself. There are, in fact, a number of projects that are being shown upstairs, but there is a very interesting, very recent project, which is the submission that Scott has made for the Prada Museum, which I think is particularly worth noting as a recent engagement with this territory. Preston Scott Cohen is currently an associate professor of architecture at the Graduate School of Design, Harvard University, and has published, his work has been published in numerous European and American publications. He is the editor of a new book to be published on the work of Eric Owen Moss. As I said, we are very much pleased that he's here. Would you please join me in welcoming Preston Scott Cohen?
Thanks, Mason. I'm really delighted to be here. It's been a place I've thought about for many years. Always thought was so, let's say, the best place, really, for experimentation. I'm really grateful to you for having me. We're going to miss Mason at the GSD. Anyway, well, as Mason has said, I'm going to talk about formal experimentation. And I hope you'll find it an optimistic approach, even if involving negative critique, so to speak, in the Adornian tradition. Sort of. Anyway, this renewed commitment to experimentation and formal problems, I want to think of it as, because by now so many of us think of it as an exhausted subject. I think this exhaustion is something we need to overcome, or without, let's say, avoiding or shifting focus to another area. Well, anyway, I'll start with just telling you how I'm going to lay this out. I want to talk in 4 pieces. First, I'll give you some background, some of the projects that have led into the later projects that you will see in the exhibition. After this, I will talk about hypotheses and formal techniques of experimentation, and finally show you some of these test case projects, like the Prada. So I want to begin by talking about these background projects. They are really mainly concerned with what now I would refer to as traditional linguistic conventions, the classical and vernacular stylings under which architecture has operated with legibility, that have supposedly been uprooted by successive waves of modernism and are at best a memory. In this, Tafuri provides an interest because of his speaking about the historical origins of the problem that is of, let's say, transgressing the conventions of a language, a possible architectural language, which is incessantly thwarted by its self-consciousness, its consciousness of its own obsolescence. My desire is to enliven these mute forms, or it was in these projects, these early projects I want to show you, these forms that are left over after so much has been ossified, if you will, by conventions, the conventionality of the present, or after so much has been exiled, like the orders or even explicit iconography and so forth. So the aim is to, in these projects, identify unresolvable problems within this lexicon of inherited linguistic problems. An assumption affecting all these early projects, or all of the projects even, is a suspicion that contemporary architecture is largely devoid of formal eminence, the autonomous character of a work that is not primarily predicated on the harmonic relationship of parts to wholes, as Albertian concinitas was, for example, but which refers to systems of linguistic combination and the intrinsic tensions arising from them. Tension is what distinguishes eminence from concinitas. That is, because tension perpetuates multiplicitous interpretations and transformations rather than solving problems in terms of an absolute model or harmony, as it were. Those things would be forbidden, obviously. I'm going to show two sets of problems, sets of projects, as I said. The earlier ones involving this, maybe I could turn on the slides now. This attempt to render peculiar certain historically inherited linguistic operations on the left. And one of the diagrams of that is on the left from the early one of the houses I'll show you. And the recent projects elaborating on the linguistic themes of the earlier ones within an entirely different lexicon. Architecture sustained in a different language, a language defined by transforming techniques of descriptive geometry. As I will describe the projects, for the most part, I've isolated the problem of the bearers of architectural eminence to two primary characters, seriality and symmetry. These bridge the largely effaced lexicon of architectural types and techniques remarked upon in the earlier projects and the projective language of elasticity in the newer projects. To sustain eminence, or attention, as a point of departure, requires frustrating and making unrealizable the models of reference, or an eidos even. That is, in my sense, in my case, the ideal forms of seriality and symmetry. This frustration is synthesized by techniques of distortion that defer or keep alive the formal reference and ideals. For me, contact with distant models, inaccessible because always somehow confounded. This is something really key to the survival of architecture, in my opinion. Anyway, before I go into this whole story about the distortion, there are the ways it's done. Just think I should say one thing about autonomy. It's an old thing you'll know already, but the claim to formal autonomy is always paradoxical because the autonomous aspects of architecture they only thrive because they are caught up in the very reality from which they claim to be distinguished. They have to, let's say, participate in producing it and also purport to be distinguished from it. So there is no such thing, of course. I just want you to, I just have to say this because the whole discussion about things being on their own is always predicated on this misunderstanding that they are really on their own. Or frequently it's predicated on that. Anyway, back to these early projects. Maybe I'll go on with those now. Okay, well, these are, oh, I'm sorry, two more slides, just trying to compare the two tendencies. Well, this is one of the first projects. In these projects, different systems are intertwined, different orders and typologies. Features of conventional buildings are bracketed off to become the afterimage of a kind of overdetermined formal process. So the hope is that the whole, if there is one at all, might be said to be continually thwarted because of the conflictual, though interdependent relationships between parts and wholes. hopefully doing away with the problem of parts altogether. Anyway, the impulse to a resolution, if you will, of conflicts, let's say, that inhibit the final completion of any of the so-called wholes. These motivate discrepancies between fenestration systems, centers, various patterns of arrangement, rooms, and so forth. So in this house, this house is in Florida. I have a few houses there. This one is, well, it's like a typical suburban ranch house in the United States, or more like a split level in a way, mixed with a ranch house. So just imagine, if you will, that this is a kind of normal building like that with a, where's that? Oh, fabulous thing. Oh, never had a chance to use one of these. Okay, there. It's one of these big, long bar, plain old houses like that with a garage in front. And the street's out there normally, right? And well, that's how they are. Take my word for it. With a garage there, and then you enter the house there normally. Well, in this case, the street is here, so the house has been in a way set down wrong on the site, and you have to go through here to get to the entrance, which is there. Okay. Well, anyway. So you come up here, and you come in there. And this whole facade is a repetition of that one. So that facade and that facade are identical in their measure. But there are all sorts of problems when one superimposes this bar on the left, this whole bar, onto this one. And that is part of the interest, among other things. So, for example, both of them have this end facade, this slightly bent end facade with two windows. Here you can see the two windows and the slightly bent end facade for that bar. And that then becomes, and converges and becomes synonymous with the front of itself, that is, its other, the street facade. So this idea of replication, or the duplication that then forces this kind of merging, produces all sorts of other interesting results, which got me into trouble. Like the window, which they said was a sign of the incompetence of the architect, that could not have its shutters open. There are shutters there. If you look there, you can kind of see them. One of them only opens, well, not quite 90 degrees to the window. No big deal, but they really took offense to it. Oh, it's remarkable. Well, the fact that the building... The fact that the building, that was the symptom they saw. So, the whole problem. The fact that the building hits the ground at all directly, I should show you pictures of how these houses are made. They normally have these cascading lawns that build up to them. This one coming down severe like that was really what upset them. There were no rules that prohibited it, and they were most of it unhappy. And so they turned to the issue of fenestration, since they did have one rule that said that it would need to be well resolved, and mine wasn't. So that was one excuse to turn us down. But they later gave in. In any case, the house wasn't built, unfortunately, for other reasons. Anyway, other things happen, like, since you enter that way and the whole thing is repeated, you're right in the middle of the house when you enter it. Let's say within the whole precinct of the house. That's that point of entry. And the pool, which is normally at the back of the house, it would be seen as the main body of the house, is now right at the front door of it. And other things, well, things in back or in the front, and at the same time, all this is immersed in the dialectic of all sorts of columnar and volumetric figures that are very distinct and legible, hopefully. Section one, that's what happens when you go in under the first facade, and there's the real door. Well, I'm not going to do all the little readings, but some of those windows wander on to the side, and several figures like this one become very important. This column in front of that cruciform bit of window is repeated in front and in back. Here's the diagram explaining that. So that when you in the house, that same motif repeats, but when you see it, and you turn around, you see it again. There are all these kind of structures of memory and so forth built into the building. It finds itself on a site. Yes, it does. Well, as I said, it was put down there kind of 90 degrees to it. This is a second one that I did, and the first to investigate this theme of elasticity, which I'll show you more intensely later. But here, the elasticity is to do with, not with attenuation, or no, well, let's say no, it does have to do with attenuation, but it doesn't have to do with convergence, as it will in the later things. So instead of repeating certain figures and having them merge and produce difficulties and displacements of center, and I should have done a reading about that center displacement. That's really the key in the other project. Anyway, now similar configurations are distorted proportionally relative to one another along certain axes in order to correct certain problems, so to speak, correct, but never being able to. Here would be, let's say, an ideal toward which they might wish to return, but never do. This, because of something that happens in the plan, which I don't have in this diagram to show you. There's another one for that. But anyway, here you can see that this part of the facade is expanded relative to that. Some shear occurs as a result of that. Shear in elevation corresponds to a seam in plan, and the shear in elevation corresponds to, wait, which one is it? Seam in elevation is shear in plan. Well, there's this kind of inverse relationship between shears and seams resulting from these transformations of the proportions, which are elastic. That is, area remains constant as opposed to proportion, as where proportion, let's say, constant would be a kind of scaling operation. Here, instead, area is the invariant. The question of the invariant and the transformative parts of the language become very important. Anyway, there's something else going on in this, which I could not, oh, well, I'll just show you quickly the project. Well, there is a kind of void that results from all of those difficulties of shearing and translocation. If you just look at the three windows for a moment, you'll sort of get the idea of the project. Just stare at the three windows and nothing else, and you'll see they're tugging leftward. But of course, these two, where am I? Oh. These two, in a way, find themselves centered in that figure which has gone through these elastic transformations. This would be the facade doing its work. There's a whole problem in the plan. I like hearing David laugh. Anyway, this is, well, there's this whole other thing going on in the plan. Well, you can see here now that something develops across the plan, which is breaking this structure into these fragments which really aren't structural in the end. There you can see there's a fourth window that actually makes these two a pair of higher ones and these a pair of lower ones. The triadic kind of pattern is now turning into something serial again, so that symmetry and seriality are here very much meshed. The building, that's the interior. I think left and right are reversed. Anyway, I won't go all into the plan on this one. Anyway, the sequence is not unlike the other one. You ascend into the center of it, and there's a void kind of courtyard there. Very dense all around that void. And then, at the back of the building, one more of these problems where the plan, which has induced these horizontal and vertical movements, the vertical ones being represented there, for example, or there, or there, has gotten tangled up with this pattern of windows, which makes sense in a way here only, but produces occasions where windows make no sense at all, and others which make perfect sense. Some are right over their proper kitchen sink, and others are where they couldn't possibly let light or make views for anything. So there's a moment when the window is sending mixed messages. It's pure form, and then at another moment, utterly conventional. That's part of the intention here, that it would draw, it's a kind of house playing dead. It would draw you into this promise of pure form and syntax, but turn out to be a kind of lingua franca. There's a shadow of Rossi, a shadow of Los, something else, the memory of generic aspects of architecture, certain kinds of walls and windows. In this way, it tries to be, well, between this issue of the memory and the loss problem, the architecture of melancholia as opposed to a very hopeful one. This ends up sort of exhausting this whole thing in a way for me. This is another one. Here, something else happens. I begin with this kind of schema. They all have these kind of schematic origins, which I've shown you a piece or two of in the facades of the previous ones. And here's one again. This one, I was frustrated because actually this is a proper vertical projection of it, but the building should, on this occasion, I wish to have it be turning more. Something that's resolved much better by descriptive geometry. I'll show you later. But here you'll see that these swabs begin to mutually, cut one another up in a very systematic way. This leads into, or converges with, ever so coincidentally, two pediments. One which is laterally organized relative to the street, and the other frontal to it. There's the lateral one, the frontal one. And these converged through with this schema, which has its own interdependent relationships to produce this indeterminate combination, if you will, between the syntax and the promise of a more iconographic memory of suburban houses. This leads into something more to do with what I want to call the problem of the relation between discrepancy and distortion in architecture. The discrepancy having to do with the distance. Let's say any particular formal resolution has any distance it might be seen to have from its origin, if there is one, or towards some idea that is, so to speak, not just like it, but in some other state in the mind, whose ever that is that happens to be reading it. And then distortion is something else, more to do with the particular way a form is not that thing. The operation that makes it different from that ideal, if you will, or if not ideal, other pattern that is not exactly fixed by the object. So this whole problem gets into the relationship between the discrepancies internal to forms, relationship to its reference, and to the techniques by which one would articulate or map them out, that is, drawing. A lot of problems drawing this project. Here's the picture window intersected by the meandering sidewalk, if you will. There's the sequence of entry seen obliquely. And the section, rather conventional in a way. I think the next one is more conventional, actually, and the house evolves into something else. That's on the right, showing the section through the frontal pedimental figure, which is the entry. Sorry, oops. Okay. This is backwards up here, so I'm really it's going to be interesting. The right's on the left, and the left's on the right. Anyway, okay. It's kind of like the projects sometimes are. All right, let me see. Forward on the right. Let's see, left. No, never mind. All right, I'll just go forward on both. This is just a little project that came out of that. It was in addition to a house in New Jersey. I mean, from Florida to New Jersey, wherever autonomy has to be. Well, in this case, the original, no, it's not a cynical comment. It's just where my mind was, I had to do this. It actually made perfect sense to me then. This little house exists. It's a very funny little house right here. I think the laser, oh, there it is. Yes, this whole thing exists. And it's made of whole buildings that all together made a house. That was the first one, then they added that one, then they added that one. So the question of this aggregative process interested me. They wanted to build one big new aggregate. It was bigger than all of the previous ones put together. So this was the way to do that without simulating this aggregative procedure. And now I would be better prepared to deal with this in terms of literally being able to work within a procedure which is aggregative in its logic. This one isn't, but anticipates some of the effects that will be produced when that does work out. here the kind of scaling of the window and this pressure to expand. Again, you see the shear. The shear will produce a very distinct figure, which you won't get to see because I'm really not going to show you this one too much. Anyway, another one that came out of this was an apartment, which project to combine two previously disconnected units. This is the division line. All sorts of columns and shafts and bathrooms and all this stuff, which made no sense for being linked, and they had a plan for doing it. And we had to go with the budget of that normal plant and the same staff to build it, which was an interesting thing. So anyway, I tried to find a way through these repetitive figures, which are transforming. There are 3 of those. And these are all produced by minimum and maximum distances allowable within this little space to make a corridor, really. That's the whole project, just to make a corridor. They wanted all these wonderful rooms. I just said the only thing we could make is a good corridor out of it. Anyway. So, okay. I'll go into the new projects now. Well, not only because of the technical difficulties after that last house, the house I showed you where I couldn't even draw all of it. In fact, I had to invent my own ways of doing that, and they weren't very good. I became aware, well, that was one of the problems. And the other was this problem from the other one, previous to that, was the way these orthogonal and non-orthogonal systems and combinations have a very, well, for me, it seemed that they were inherently limited in terms of their permutational options. And it was clear, and there was no doubt in my mind, that all of the geometries that I've been using in the other projects required the instantiation of tension as a separate process from the actual forms that would, when combined, produce it. That is, it had to be induced by methods of superimposition, by methods, as I said, that dealt with different proportions, conflicts in dimension, and so forth, different centers oscillating, and all of those things. And I wanted the tension to arise from within the very logic that defined the lineaments themselves of the forms. That is, I wanted it to be there before I began even working on it, somehow already inherent. So anyway, along the way with this technical problem, I got involved in this descriptive geometry, how to even just to come to terms with some of these non-orthogonal forms, not all of which I really like, and I must say I still don't really always like these non-orthogonal forms. It's a peculiar problem to be producing things, the effects of which are not always desirable. And I'm not sure what's going to happen about that. But anyway, instead of doors and windows and building types being the kind of source material, the progenitors for this deformational relationship between different paradigms, this new method, or a method new to me, descriptive geometry itself, could provide quite a lot. Somewhere in here I have a good point to make about it, but all right. What happens here is that I found this the distance point method of perspective projection provided a very interesting potential link between the 2 types of discrepancy that I mentioned earlier. One, the discrepancy between drawings and buildings, and the other between buildings and their paradigms. And the idea that somehow these could be parallel discrepancies became very interesting, that because if they were, perhaps the paradigm itself, in the formal end of it, would be already inscribed in a discrepancy, that is, between its conception and its depiction in a drawing. So anyway, this method does something great because it requires, when drawn in 2 dimensions, that the object be reversed in relation to its perspective. So if you look at this, hard to look at drawing. I'll do it down here. If you look at this object here, let's call that, this right here. Let's call that an object just for a moment. And then this thing, this bluish or purplish thing, is the same thing mirrored in perspective, that is reversed. But it is, if we were to reverse this one back, a correct perspective of it from a particular point. The particular point being way off out there. Anyway, these are all converging on a measuring point and these on a distance point. What happens then, the other thing that's interesting about this method is that either the object or the perspective could be the other. That is, perspective could be the object the perspective. So there's reversibility built into what is a kind of coherent totality around an axis, but a totality which is already compromised by distortion. Anyway, let's see. The other thing that happens is the combination, hitting the wrong thing. The combination with, stereotomy. This is a key combination because stereotomy involves convergences, as does perspective, but more than one, depending on how many surfaces there are to converge. In this case, if you can see it, this point resolves that portion of that object. And so does, let me find one more. Here's another one. This whole side is converging here. And they both converge on a line that they share. This line now will be shared by the convergence of other points coming from the other object. These two objects, by the way, are related just as these are. One is the perspective of the other. So this idea of the centrality of the single point of view that is inherent to perspective is refuted, if you will, by the multiple points, which turn the question of perspective, turn it off. I mean, it turns now into a problem of infinite points. This is orthographic projection now. We're at no particular distance from the object. It's immeasurable. So in the end, this conflation they confound one another, that is, the orthogonal and the perspectival, producing a kind of effect which I would like to think of as anamorphic, but one which can never be experienced wholly. That is, one cannot recuperate the point from which to regain the correct view of the object. There isn't one, actually. So looking at this one on the left, this comes out of this experiment. This is, the rest of that diagram. It's there. The two halves, they've been distinctly defined by different degrees of massiveness or void. But if you look here, you can actually see the original diagram realized in 3 dimensions. What happens with stereotomy is stereotomy defines a 3-dimensional entity. Once one defines 2 views, it explains what was only a flat image projected onto a picture plane. It describes it as fully blown 3-dimensionally. I do have to induce the 3rd dimension, of course, and this is among the many of these operations which are negotiable in the project. A very interesting one, because later any dimension that I would produce will be necessarily taken up as data for future perspective iterations. So, for example, any perspective would need to know all of the dimensions of the object of which it is a perspective. So, giving any particular dimension or any particular depth to any given perspective would later, in any future iteration, make impossible the, let's say, decipherment of any arbitrary moment of intervention. All of it seeming to be as arbitrary or as motivated. This, you can see, is the void recollection, so to speak, of the perspective of the other object, which isn't here, but later is replaced by yet another one. That's another story, which I can't go into. But here, I want to also, though, now talk to other aspects of it as a thing. Well, it was a building, a duplex, actually, proposed in a specific site, which I'll show you in a minute. It wasn't that originally, but it became that. Here, if we go back to this particular view, the voided element has in a way been reversed and mirrored out as this block, which in turn replaced, as I said, the earlier iteration. There is then this kind of process whereby the whole procedure isn't always present. Certain things result from this which interest me. For example, once we get to the other side, because this has been extracted from that void, this is the other side of all of that, it ends up appearing as though it were, let's say, a block just set down upon some other one. But this is not the case when we turn the corner. It's smeared out, coplanar, seeming totally continuous. There are other things like that, readings that confound certain ways of thinking about the building, which interest me. Like this one, well, there's some kind of rotation around this pivot point there that's implied, but if one were to go in the interior, it's blocked up in such a way that there would be no way to rotate these planes relative to one another and return them to a single one. On and on. There are many different kinds of relationships other than those that involve the kind of illusionism or distorted appearance, which is most evident in a view like that, I think, where anamorphosis is implicit but not realized. Here, just a little further along, this entire entity is just embedded in the larger block. But there are other things having to do with different morphologies of spatial density, and as I said, so for example, a plane like this, or a wall like this one, is in plein air, if you will. It just defines two different exteriors, but it would implicitly seem as though it were the exterior of a volume comparable to some other. There is an idea that all of this space, which on the interior I'll show you in a minute, is a terrace, is void, that carved out of so much solid, and that this is a kind of solidity that's very different than this solidity. I mean, this solidity is the block of the building out of which is carved void, into which is immersed total solidity, and which extends into mere planarity. So it's like ground as opposed to rock. There are different densities that I'm looking for, and each of these is realized by one or more of the permutations that derive the interdependent symmetries and distortions. I haven't mentioned seriality. I meant to go over that with you, but there's an implicit serial operation within the distance point perspective. I do need to tell you about that. It's very important, actually. I'll show it to you quickly. You know when you draw perspective, and sometimes you only draw the perspective of a plan first, and then you elevate the plan. You take the data off the section to elevate it and give the third dimension, all of the walls rising off of that plan. Well, this is a perspective. If we were to assume that object that I described first over there on the left were a plan, that's on the right, that other thing that I was explaining as a perspective of it, is just a perspective of the plan. So we have a plan and a perspective of the plan, and they are in this distortive mirroring relationship. This down here involves the addition, if you will, of heights. You know, if we were to add the walls, we should give dimension to the plan perspective. And it produces something which coincides with skiography, projection of shadows. So if you look at this point, it moves to that point, right there, or that point to that point, that point to that point. So this entire object, in a way, is reproduced. Just behind it is a shadow of it. But the shadow is, in fact, technically, taking all of the data from the section of this object and adding it into the plan, producing within the perspective technique, distance point, the third dimension. This is not the same third dimension that I referred to earlier, which involves my own addition with stereotomy of an actual third dimension. This is the pictorial third dimension within distance point projection. So there is this kind of double over back and forth between 2D and 3D. The project moves from illusion to description and back to illusion, well, really on two parallel tracks twice. Okay. Here's, I'll go through that one. Okay. Just to show you, there's something else that happens. It does matter which way in particular any given perspective is inflated, if you will, into 3 dimensions, and or the relationships of the distance points, the eye points, and the vanishing points. These are earlier. There are many, many of these options, which you can see produce very different effects. You can see how attenuated the perspective is there. They each one produce very different relationships. And I would show you this view only to point out that, for example, had this been inflated, this void, ever slightly more or less, it would have created quite a different effect. For example, any greater, this line right here would advance forward and obliterate this entire piece of the facade, making illegible the identity of this region as void, or protecting it as a terrace. If it were any less, if this were to inflate any less, that entire line moving back would make voids like that or like this completely disappear. It's like a stone sinking into water. The void would become interiorized entirely. So many times it's a very delicate procedure of advancing or contracting certain figures in order to catch the right relationship. There it is in this site, strangely finding itself in the middle of a courtyard in Paris. Anyway, I'm not going to explain all of how that works to you. It's pretty interesting, but no, I'll move on. Here's the plan. It's 2 units back to back. Well, you come through the site through a path under this building and into this site, and the building occupying it makes all sorts of yards relate to one another very differently. It's like Mises courtyard houses where the parts of one overlap into the yards of others. In this case, the wall does that, as opposed to a roof. Begins to define space beyond this particular plot. Anyway, you ascend into one unit this way, the other you go straight into, and they're interlocked in this kind of, well, a way very much like the earlier projects, actually. There's a moment, though, where the facade is completely drawn into the building, and one is looking across this gap from one unit to the other. And the facade is seen as both the, from the point of view of being behind it as a mask when one enters here, and there's the facade, which one understands to be frontal from that direction. So one is certainly coming in from behind, having seen the almost realized symmetry out in the front side. There it is in the site, it's squeezed in. Well, at this point, I started looking for different Ur forms. I was sitting in a lecture. I hope that lecture was more boring than this one. And I just started drawing them. Many, many different possible origin forms that could be subjected to operations, which already in and of themselves have difficult problems. Of course, one keeps backing up. It's a kind of infinite regress. Anyway, there's another version of the project you just saw on the right. Here's the skiographic project. I tried to do only with skiography what I'd been doing with perspective. It didn't work out very well. There's one of those. That's upstairs. Several projects came out of this. Well, there was one about the horizon, which was set off quite at some distance from the building, producing this horizontal axis. That's the slide on the right. And then this project for the Head Start competition involving, a different genealogy, I think, than the last one. I hope I can explain that quickly and well. But it's to do with the fact that these two are mirrored, as you have seen already in the other. But then the horizontal mirroring, which occurs along that line, more or less, making this entity here a mirror of that whole entity, means that ultimately this final moment, well, this piece, which belongs to that, theoretically, no longer is commensurate with it due to a kind of an alignment where the mirroring line is displaced from it necessarily by the fact that it is only here, the mirroring line. The mirroring line then being projected back on all of these surfaces from some distance from them would make all of these points along that line not meet with the object which they should be correctly aligned, with which they should be correctly aligned. Let me see if I can point to something a little easier to understand. Making sure that you understand the mirroring well, I'm going to just point something out. Here's, let's call that initial line, the ground line within the distance point perspective. operation. And this figure here on the left, as you can see, is that figure there. There is just one example of it. It happens here again, this entire entity, which is all of the classrooms that take this entire field. And this figure, the programs for the community, including the auditorium and so forth, they are, in a way, iterations of one another, horizontal and vertical attenuations of the same object. These are the projection drawings. I should just say the projection drawings involve calculating the distance point perspective, the stereotomic operation, which gives it 3 dimensions, the unfolding of all of its planes to find their true shapes and their relationships to one another, that is, all of the intersections between all of these planes. Some of these problems are solved more effectively in the computer, not more quickly, I should say, more accurately. These are from the horizontal piece that houses all of the classrooms. And there's the project. It's, well, let me just back up for 1 second. This, hold on just a second. There. This whole corner of the project is drawn back by the logic of the attenuation, but it has done so in a way in order to provide this quadrant of the side a space for the playground, so that there is a kind of there's an opportunity to have the attenuations correspond with certain restraints. In this case, then, the playground is foregrounding the building. Normally, they're not. It's been lowered sufficiently that it is able to be there by the parking lot, but it's engaged with this stepping and also in relation to the lobby where one can observe the playing. This is the entry. And the auditorium is there, and all of this is the kitchen and kind of common area, the 5 classrooms, these 5. And upstairs community programs, like, well, clinic and so forth. What else should I remark upon here? There are strange coincidences and intersections help develop certain relationships for light and viewing in the building. Oh, it's backwards. Okay. And there you can see a model exposing some of the interior, the auditorium intersecting the lobby area. This large window, it leads into the auditorium. A Breuer window? I didn't mean for it to be one of those, but the parking lot is just taking exactly the dimension allowable. Curious, in every competition entry project I saw, that was the shape of it. The project fills exactly the site. It's a very difficult one because of its limits. It was meant as a prototype. The permutational options provided, I had hoped, would be useful for taking place on different sites. Oh, let me say something. There's something else happening which has to do with different models of elasticity, which are interesting to me. One is, let's say this one, the low house of McKimbing and White, where clearly we can recognize the attenuation of this pedimental figure, which we all know is an icon. And we can understand the distance, literally within the object, between this icon, which has some normative proportion that we remember but don't fully understand, and this one, which is clearly attenuated from it, a horizontally extended version. Then on the other hand, there's something else, which is this version of it. This is the ceiling in the oratorio of Borromini, which has the attenuation built into it by means of making comparisons already built into it. I mean, rather than to a distant model. We can clearly see that that one relative to that one has been distorted. I'm interested in both of these operations simultaneously taking place. This is sort of one of the key motives of the project. that it be something remembered and something that's inscribed in the object directly. And this is another one which involved the projection of a roof out of the building block, which is in fact a perspective of the entire building. There were many iterations of this where in fact it produced a ground and a roof. They were mirroring simultaneously rather than iteratively the same object. This is all then taken into and built into what I call the perspective machine, which was made on the computer finally. The distance point method now is shown in 3 dimensions and unfolded back into 2, literally. And no, those are not computer-generated models. Peter Beard remarked to me how funny it would be if they were, because they would be simulating, of course, cardboard. They were produced by projections done within the computer, the model on the right, but certainly they are cardboard. Boolean, well, you know, the problems of making negative or positive any entities that intersect. This becomes a very interesting area of investigation. Because, for example, you can see that this is the same model here, and very different realizations of the same model. This entity being the perspective, by the way, of all of the block. And in this case, it's negated. This entity is the perspective with the addition of heights that I referred to, that is actually a skiographic projection. All of these are the Booleans in the interior result in this project. What was actually done with this project was that the earlier model you were looking at was transformed by means of this extreme compression. You can see it in the right slide. That is the same object compressed radically, and finally realized in this hybrid Boolean model. That is hybrid because no solid or void is whole. Certain planes have been selectively removed in addition to the procedures of negating or unioning different entities. There are, let's say, 9 objects latent here. But certain planes of coincidence, again, try to erase distinctions, let's say returning it to a more homogeneous whole. For example, you can see this plane here unifying many of those objects, this one happening to be one face of an object, which cuts through so many others, treating heterogeneity as homogeneity, so to speak. Okay. At least it's eventually there. Well, I thought probably the comparison, well, the anamorphic effect as opposed to the resolution which allows its recovery. There's the kind of recuperation on the other side of the building. A very ironic student visiting with me, the wonderfully ironic, this at Trinità di Monti in Rome. This anamorphosis. Bringing me to the last project, the Prado competition, which, well, it's an odd project actually because they want the building to disappear or to become some megastructure which would solve all their problems simultaneously, I think. The motives for the competition don't seem very good. But anyway, creation of a new entry is the primary problem, I think. They ask that we do that because the building can no longer absorb all of the programs that come along with the entry, like shops and cafe and all of those things. So the question is a very, I would say, an irreducibly architectural problem, because how does one provide the primary but necessarily separate entrance to a building which, in a way, has lost its capacity to provide an entry for itself? Well, it seemed, as I said, that there would be some totalizing device which would somehow be, let's say, Louvre-like, or on the other hand, a mere appendage looking at the same architects, and it's in my city, so I can comment on it. The Museum of Fine Arts in Boston was just this annex-like building, except that they wished that either of these solutions, as I said, disappear given the constraints to make the building stay so low, which they kept bearing down with during the project. They even changed the competition rules repeatedly to make it more, to suppress the building further. Anyway, I didn't do that. I thought that this entry needed to be on a par with the original building, that the whole addition should somehow stand aside it rather than be an appendage. That is, it should be self-complete and inflected at the same time in a very particular way. So that in this case, what I've done is made a facade here which is, in a way, making this space become a very clearly defined one, dangerously, really, because it would put so much focus on this building, which is, in fact, such a much better building than any of these. This is the Academy of Languages. Anyway, in order to, let's say, deflect attention from that, this one has been inflected slightly in a very, well, you'll see, measured way. And it has been, if you will, once again attenuated into a plaza. The facade, therefore, occupies as well as defines that space. This leads toward a plaza here, points toward, I should say. One enters by bypassing this plinth, which is elevated slightly, foregrounding the building, not allowing one to gain access directly to it. One bypasses and enters onto this elevated terrace, this whole thing being very subtly sloped in various ways. This is only about 2-3 feet higher than that. One can sit on these things, these modulations, and wander out onto this terrace and just take a look out, whatever. Anyway, this draws one into this void, which I will explain is the columnless portico. Oh, no wonder. Okay. Well, there, I'll go back over here on the right to the entry again. You come into that entry there and end up winding around and back into the original point of entry, which had been situated right there by a grand stair that I'm replacing. The building once didn't have that stair, so it seemed legitimate to take it away again. Let's see. Wrong way. Okay. These are again, the projections. You can see the building now from behind. This is that portico linking with the existing building. And these projections take from a form which is derived, well, it's derived from another building, a building which we were required to make, with which we were required to make a link, which is a cloister next to the church, San Geronimo's, behind the museum. This building then is taken into distortions and merged with the portico of the original one to produce this form, which is, of course, stretched out, as I said, into a plinth, which engages that urban space. These are just some of the projections that developed that. This is that other building that I was referring to, which I have taken, extended. This cloister exists, and the museum is taking this site for itself as an administrative portion of the museum. And I've converted this, if you will, into what I call a rectilinear spiraculate. The plinth existing, bending up into this bar, which in turn bends around the cloister. That entire entity has been taken through, or in a way, through some transformations, and combined with the syntax of this elevation, having once been the entry, to produce this piece, although it in turn is converted by other operations and related to its extension. I apologize for this. I've got to get this right. Okay. There are, again, the booleans that will produce the voids, allowing entry and viewing. from different views, different readings would be possible again. In this case, this entire entity, which is this one, I've just extracted this as a diagram, is, let's say, that piece having been attenuated extremely toward the plaza. This is what I had referred to earlier as a place to linger upon entering the building. Viewed frontally, it should seem to be on a par, near symmetrical, and so forth. But from the view I've showed you previously, it should seem, or would maybe read, as though it were entirely a separate building, this being the corner of it, this being the side of it, a building which isn't really entirely engaged with this one. Later, though, it is linked, or revealed to be, and it helps funnel views and make this a very particular connection for entering the building, the old building. This is a plan, a lower plan actually, where you can see that the plinth is taken by an auditorium, the galleries and workshops that link back toward these. This is another cloister which I've produced, which allows administrative areas to link back to the old cloister. The interior of the lobby, well, the involutions, if you will, of the planes produced by the initial scheme of Booleans is shown there. This, I could say many other things about the effects and the interest in how this building would engage a public that needs to not only be participating in the museum itself. There were many problems having to do with allowing this to be a passage through the city, which is altogether disengaged from the problems of the museum. In fact, you were allowed to move through this space without entering the museum proper. That ramp will allow one to go up and make the actual entry. These are lower levels. The building just keeps going down into garages and other programs serving. Sections, auditorium. Well, anyway, I did wanted to say the last thing about some of these techniques that now, having gone into the computer, are becoming very interesting. And on the one hand, the techniques invite us to return to these, what we thought were obsolete methods of descriptive geometry, because, as you all know, all of the organization of these programs is based on the XYZ coordinate system, and projections are related by those means that we have, many of us, forgotten in terms of all of the intricacies that they involve. It's a very interesting thing to discover in how many ways these computer programs conceal from view the techniques of descriptive geometry and how they resist allowing them to be articulated. It's a coincidental return because it also allows this return to descriptive geometry a reawakening of techniques that were even purged from our education as architects this century, which had been devoted to describing things that we lost interest in describing, the orders mainly. And also because it disappears just at a moment when formal experimentation was something on the horizon. That is, with cubism, let's say, in painting, and our affection for it as architects, some of us, our affection for it, is somehow thwarted by the disappearance of the very techniques which could have given it to us in 3 dimensions. So just at this moment, a kind of fallback to an irretrievable model, which is just before us, presented in these modern technologies. On the other side, on the outside, if you will, these technologies of representation and conception lead architecture back to its paradoxical autonomy, in my view, because the wireless digital world is impartial with respect to architectural configurations, working as well in one typology as another. These technologies have no particular place to take in architecture and wish not to at all, and our need to calcify, or let's say, fetishize, as you know, these technologies as something everywhere prevalent in our field. It's a desire, I think, shared by too many people at the moment. Anyway, these information technologies, in a way, they diffuse the calcifying, they diffuse the particulars of function in architecture and how they would interrelate with form. Mosen mentioned that. And they leave architectural space alone, if you will. And so they draw us back to a question which I love very much, finally, which is, what could happen to architecture when it's left to its own devices? The whole problem of these technologies moves all the way through from conception to the way we would finally occupy any space produced out of them. Anyway, I'm just going to end it there. And anyway, I really appreciate it. Thank you for coming. Thanks.
I'm sure there'll be some questions. Maybe those people who have to leave could leave very quickly, and then we'll start a few questions.
No more questions?
It's actually great that this stuff comes through with a lot of sort of energy in a way. That reads very well.
Oh, thanks. Wish I was a little more prepared to speak about it.
I will start with the first question. Maybe there are two questions, but I think it's the same question. One is that in the first few projects that you showed, the houses in particular, there's a very clear set of intentions between the idea of the so-called normalcy of these projects on their site in Florida, related to contemporary conditions of suburban housing and so on, and the kind of deformations and distortions that come precisely from the formal manipulations of the project. Then in the second part of the presentation, you seem to, in a way, do away with this, or it appears that you're trying to do away with this reference to the kind of conditions of normalcy, as if the thing is normal, but it isn't, and so on, to the point where the projects clearly are very direct manifestations of their distortion. And yet, there is a reference to anamorphosis, and the idea that, in a sense, there is this relationship between the architectural project and the architectural project as a project of anamorphosis. Now, I think one of the things that becomes very interesting is to make a distinction, or to try and see whether you think it would be fair to make a distinction between anamorphosis in painting and the possibilities of an anamorphic architecture. Because I think in the context of anamorphic painting, obviously there is this simultaneous tension between the painting as a deformation, as a distortion, and the simultaneous tension with its condition of normalcy, because there's always that single point where the painting is capable of returning to its possibility of normalcy. Whereas in architecture, this possibility is, or this is an impossibility, I should say. There's always the moment of the initiation of the project that might be read as a kind of normalcy, but in fact, the three-dimensional model and so on can never regain that relationship of the body to the architectural project that can bring it back to the condition of normalcy. So how do you, in a sense, begin to address this question of, if you like, the leaving behind of the site and its reference to the contemporary American suburb on the one hand, and what I would call the impossibility, in a sense, of having anamorphosis become a kind of three-dimensional architectural project where the distortion is clearly something that's readable. How do you regain that tension in the project? Is it possible?
Yeah. No. Okay. Well, on the one hand, there's the largely effaced architectural language that I was referring to, that you're speaking about, the suburban problem with respect to, and as you said, desire to move it out of that very reality, which makes it disappear entirely. And on the other, the desire to reclaim, or to to find architecture originating completely elsewhere, so that it would no longer risk this disappearance from the beginning. That's one way to look at it. I guess between the tensions that you've described, my hope is that somehow there's still the comparable way of thinking that would happen, and there would be a comparable way of interpreting the works. I think that's what I'm always thinking. In other words, one approaches either the early or the late, inquiring into the causes. That is, distortion elicits an interpretation. It asks for one to follow up, to go into what could be the causes and from where things have come and how these things have matured in this particular form. It means, though, that one has to be inclined to do that kind of research. I don't think I could make a claim that either work involves more tension or it involves less. It would depend on the subject who approaches and goes into the problem of decipherment or not. Without one's inclination to go into any decipherment, that is, to decipher either the earlier work or the later, not both would lose their tensions, any that they may have. Now, with respect to the difference in the nature of the tensions, the second one is the one you're questioning the most. In the later projects, I mean, the anamorphosis, as you've said, well, it cannot be recovered, but because it is on the horizon, that is, because from certain points of view it would appear that symmetry is becoming very nearly resolved, or because when one moves to a different position, a very different reading emerges, it's something remembered, but as you said, never recuperated. It's something anticipated. It doesn't need to be. In fact, for me, once it is, the full resolution, let's say, the complete recovery would dissolve all of the problems. So for me, it hangs over the project. It's a kind of wish unfulfilled in a certain way.
It's not so much the idea of the kind of nostalgia for the recovery of some kind of conditional normalcy, but precisely that whether the question is whether ultimately the product then doesn't become a retinal project, because in the project of anamorphosis, the position of the body somehow is already inscribed in relation to the painting. How can one, in the context of this architecture, also in a way acknowledge the possibility of body's relationship to the project, where because certainly so many of these things are set up through the perspectival perceptual conditions. So ultimately, it becomes the object and the perceptual conditions of the object, rather than, for example, situations that would have to do with the inscription of the body somehow in relation to certain spatial conditions of the project. That's
okay. Well, the problem with this kind of projects is that I think the techniques that determine them, these perspectival techniques, become the overwhelming and dominant thing that gets talked about. Where for me, actually, they are not. Oddly enough, it may seem that they should be, but they really aren't. Actually, what happened was I saw the distance point perspective one day, literally. It was producing this distortion of symmetry, and I knew that this, which had always been in all of the projects, the primary motive, that there be a symmetry that is, let's say, coalescing an object which is never all together resolving in its ideal configuration, that this allowed that to happen from the inception and the inscription of the original, let's say, lineaments that produced the project. So this distortion has more to do with the comparison between different permutations of the same object that isn't there, more to do with that, and inhabiting one as void or solid, or being on the inside of one and the outside of the other, and in the mind's eye, projecting out from it, imagining what all of the relationships are in spite of one's inhabitation of them, which makes that difficult, or seeing other relationships like the coplanarities that defeat the distinctions between interior and exterior, or defeat the distinctions between objects that are seen to be separate but are not. Those having to do with inhabitation, where different readings are confounded by them, different experiences of closure and openness. These are the effects that emerge out of an architecture concerned with these problems of distortion, which are produced by these techniques. But the anamorphic effect is just one of many of the different ways this the distortion becomes legible. I don't think it's the main one. In fact, it's one of the least able to be seen, to be honest with you. I mean, that's the way I would like to see it. The problem is all the angled planes that we get, which I find too explicit. All right.
Scott.
Yes.
One thing that's really struck me, seeing all the slides, was that when you showed them the King Reed White House, and with its attenuated profile, sitting down in the ground, very kind of stable and harmonious. What I was struck by a lot of images of your projects was the same kind of stability and kind of the kind of dangerous, nasty, kind of risky quality that I would imagine might emerge from a preoccupation with anamorphic projection, which I see somehow in the crushed.
Yes.
There was one slide on the right-hand side, which was here is the volume when it's like that size, and then you go with it. And that one was incredibly intriguing to me in a way because, and the model that went with it, which where you talked about some kind of negotiation between diversity of possibilities and some kind of homogeneity as well.
Mm-hmm.
There was something scary about that seemed
About the relation between coherence and, on the other hand,
which, like in an anamorphic painting, when you stand in the right position,
mm-hmm.
you get that moment of awful recognition, like the ambassadors and the confrontation with that skull, whatever it is. That there is a feeling, a kind of visceral feeling of engagement with this awful object. And I wondered where that goes. It seems to kind of disappear somehow. And I wonder whether there must be a whole lot of stuff that's been left out as you work through these projections. And I wondered how you make the decisions about leaving it out. Because
I mean, for example, I'm sorry.
All the strange intersections, well, for example, are kind of rubbed away.
Oh no, they're in there. Unfortunately, they don't. Yeah, go ahead.
The entrance form of the Prada, for instance,
Yeah.
which is very serene.
Yeah, I know.
Strangely serene, peculiarly serene in relation to the awful complexity of the to arrive at it.
Yes.
And I wondered, there's a kind of funny paradox there.
Yes. Now, there.
About that.
That's an interesting. I mean, there is this kind of extreme condition where something so. I mean, that's something I wanted to happen in the last project. In a way, the project would be, if you will, I don't know if the word serene was the word I was thinking of, but sort of, but not so visible, even, if you can imagine such a thing with me. A project which smoothed out so many differences, and still, though, in, let's say, some kind of moment of encountering it intellectually, suddenly gets into such extreme complexity, all to build up toward an image or a total appearance and a total form which isn't commensurate with that complexity. It was something that interested me because the whole problem of suppressing the identity of the edition was something so important in this in the Prada. Now, the question about its horror, its terror, its I think it has to do with ambivalence on my part. I'm ambivalent about departing from the architecture which I am mourning in the early buildings and entering into a language which is, well, it's an utterly different one. And whether or not we could call it architecture, it becomes something which gets very complicated because it doesn't involve the same lexicon. It's exactly what Mosen is saying. So something else happens in this project, which is the motive and the head start to foreground certain aspects, certain activities, or to simply fill up the site. Certain very immediate constraints should make the reality of the building not be so completely consumed by the techniques without having it resort entirely to the realities that are constraining it. That would involve those faced linguistic operations that the earlier ones are involved in. I don't know if I can answer about the... I know there is lurking in the projects a desire to smooth over some of the complexity.
That's kind of interesting to me because it's in that you're operating in a paradoxical, another kind of paradox, which is between exhaustion and melancholia and potential.
Yes, and potential, full potential.
And optimism.
And what?
And optimism.
Yes.
Kind of sadness and an optimism.
Yes.
At the same time. But it would be, I kind of like the dangerous quality of that. I wish I could remember the name.
That's all right. It is a very bad name, so it's better not to be remembered. Okay. What, you were going to say something? Or?
No, I was interested in this thing about the anamorphosis from a slightly different point of view, and that is that, you know, when it gets to the same point, have you ever worked through the kind of permutational structures with other kinds of material other than the actual geometry, to the extent that it actually starts to inform other aspects of the project, whether it's a kind of programmatic or material or other, because you kind
He's
of...
definitely anti-program.
Well, I kind of threw that one in there,
Yeah.
so I didn't have to...
He knows that.
But
Yeah.
because I'd say it was attentive, I mean, you
Yeah.
stayed quite silent
On those two subjects, yes, inconspicuously. Well, let's see. How would I answer those? Well, the material one would be easier to answer, but it gets into, let's say, becomes formal very quickly, obviously. Thicknesses, densities, and you know, the color, and so forth. I mean, there are all sorts of things that have been...
more metaphorical than actual. I mean, that's one of the things that we do.
Well, some of them could be. For example, more than that. For example, we thought, when I was working on this, that the facade would be an ashlar of a kind of limestone, and that the plinth portion would be reinforced concrete. And there would be a moment where the ashlar, in its thinness, is lapping the plane, which is altogether reinforced concrete, revealing itself as false, thick stuff. And the thin stuff, which is laid on it, would just lay on that, fold up onto the building. So there's this moment of, you know, this sort of introduction of depth by means of forming it, and depth which is actually belonging to the material. But how does that involve the anamorphosis? Would have to do with, and this is where it isn't very good, because what happens is the thickness correlates with a proportion or a compression or an expansion, but the dimension of the ashlar is fixed already. So there are problems that have to do with the degree to which you can assume any of these things are malleable, right? I mean, again, this question of the invariant. What you're really, I think, speaking about is what are the models of reference, or the invariants, which are then deferred by distortion. And the anamorphic technique is one which can do it to the lineaments, but the degree to which it catches all of the other aspects, you're absolutely right. Now, in terms of the program, it's very difficult. In terms of the program, that's... All right. Now, actually, I wish I could explain the Prado. Well, you wouldn't like so much the program because it works so well, honestly. No, really. It just, you know, no, you might not like it because, you know, the entry it's like a Schinkel sequence, right? You go in, you turn around, you come back from where you came twice. There are actually 2 points of return. It's all very orchestrated to sort of belong in that context. But in the meantime, you're wandering through booleans and distortions of God knows what, and those things are concealed or not. It's the same kind of disappearance and appearance of syntax versus normative architecture. I guess that would be what I'm hoping, that in the way it's so well sutured in, as you said, serene, it would be in tension with all of the other operations, if one considered them. One has to be inclined to do that, though. There are no guarantees. I mean, obviously, only someone with the sensibility to look at things that way would. Well, that has to do with memory.
I have a question about judgment. In your introduction, you said that you weren't quite sure whether you liked this book or not. Your processes at the beginning strip out all the things like material and context and program, and you kind of load those into the forms at the end. And presumably, you have to exercise certain judgments in order to make the kind of program work and plan and make you don't do that for the form, even though you seem to be different.
I don't do what? I'm sorry.
Well, I imagine that when you come to translate the form that is generated by the process,
Yeah.
building forms, there's set kind of adjustments you might have to make.
Yes. Yeah.
Decide something is a window or transparent.
Yeah. And you're saying I don't do those, make those judgments? Oh, yes.
You get rid of things in the form.
Okay. I'm going to give you the best answer I can. Remember I showed you the plan. I said if this was slightly forward, it would obliterate this. If it was slightly back, it would be obliterated by. Well, I should have done a facade, shown you the facade, and shown you that void on the inside, what it would have meant. Because, for example, in the facade, what I was looking for was an equilibrium whereby the void would neither dominate nor be, let's say, inferior, let's say, subservient to the other mass, and altogether they are immersed in this larger entity which they are in competition with. So equilibrium serves as a criterion, right? And so the degree which things that appear disappear, they also have to do with serving this equilibrium. Sorry, they're also caught up in the programmatic aspects, because, for example, there's a point at which squeezing it down would make it an uninhabitable place and would not allow for this stair which I knew was there. I actually knew what the product was going to do. When you say I remove all of the program and then put it back in after, it's not exactly true. I knew the building had to withdraw in the Head Start to make a playground. So there's this kind of knowing and not knowing, pretending I don't know, so that I can be, let's say, submit to the logics and tensions of the formal operations. And then within those, in the criteria of a kind of equilibrium, there are certain operations and in those a kind of negotiation with the project which I knew but didn't let bear on the forms. It's this kind of, actually it's more, I'm presenting it afterward. These diagrams are done afterwards. This is not the way it's done. Obviously, this makes it able to be, this is only to make it to disseminate it. No, but the construction drawings are the real drawings, where the work is done, but I can't really use them to explain it to you. All right. Anyway.
Stop.
Yes.
Thank you very
Thanks.
much.
Great. Thanks.
Come back again.